Sexual reproduction can be dangerous. Just ask the male praying mantis who's about to be devoured by its mate, or the male emperor penguin who incubates an egg for months in sub-zero temperatures while his mate is off feeding, or the female deer who carries around the ever-increasing weight of her developing young while she runs from predators such as coyote. So why is this a better system than asexual reproduction? Well, let's take a look at the wonderful world of reproduction. Get your papers ready, wide right, skinny left. Animals reproduce asexually in many different ways. Some, like the amoeba, divide in two in a process called binary fission. They just split in two. Others, like the hydra, shown here, reproduce by budding, where a new individual is an outgrowth of the body wall. And still others, like the female worker bees and the whiptail, produce eggs that develop without being fertilized. This is a process called parthenogenesis. Don't worry about the word. All of these methods have two advantages. They only require one parent, so they can produce many offspring in a very short period of time. The disadvantage to this method, however, is that there is very little genetic diversity, since all of the offspring are DNA carbon copies of the parent. If the environment changes, these organisms don't adapt easily. There's not a huge gene pool of differing traits there. Sexual reproduction, as you already know, requires two parents. The advantage here is that this maintains the genetic diversity of the species. Organisms have a multitude of combinations since each offspring receives half of its genetic information from the mom and the other half from the dad. The disadvantage here is that sexual reproduction requires a dense population, a lot of organisms. Male organisms have to be able to find a mate, and vice versa with the females, in order to reproduce. Usually it's not a problem, but in some cases it's hard to find a mate. In species like the earthworm, the problem is solved by carrying reproductive organs for both male and female in its body. These organisms are called hermaphrodites. They have organs for both male and female, but they do not self-fertilize. Rather, it means when they meet any other earthworm, they can mate and fertilize each other's eggs, and genetic diversity is maintained. Pretty amazing! So, as you're starting to see, reproductive adaptations are pretty diverse. But there's more. There are adaptations to reproductive cycles, too. Invertebrates such as the cnidarian, or jellyfish, alternate between sexual and asexual reproduction, as you see in the diagram here. It's not important to know the cycle itself. That'll come later in biology too. It is important to know that invertebrates, many of them, alternate between sexual and asexual though. Think about why that is a good thing for them. Vertebrates will not reproduce asexually, but they will alternate between fertile and non-fertile cycles. There are different factors that can influence this, from the weather to the amount of water present. Another factor that affects fertility greatly is the caring of the young. If a mother is actively caring for her young, it would not be advantageous for her to have another baby at all. I'm sure you remember that in sexual reproduction, egg and sperm must meet in order for there to be a baby. This can happen either inside or outside of the egg-producing animal. Let's take a look at internal fertilization. This takes place in most aquatic and nearly all terrestrial animals. As the term states, eggs are fertilized inside the body of the egg-producing animal. In most invertebrates and some fish and amphibians, male release sperm into the water surrounding the eggs. As you see in this diagram in the fertilization of a sponge, the sperm are released, they're captured by the adult female sponge and fertilized within the female's body. Sometimes males deposit sperm directly into the female's body during mating. This happens in arthropods, some fish, some amphibians, and all reptiles, birds, and mammals. Aquatic invertebrates like crawfish and crabs, and some aquatic vertebrates like fish reproduce by external fertilization. As the term states, eggs are fertilized outside of the body of the egg-producing individual. Egg and sperm are both released into the water. Here you see a clownfish like Nemo's mom, or that could be Nemo's dad. The eggs are laid outside of the body, and then the male would swim over them and deposit his sperm, and they would just happen to land on the eggs or not. In external fertilization, gamete or sex cell release is usually synchronized with tides, moon phases, or seasons. This ensures that egg and sperm are present at the same time for fertilization. It wouldn't do if the female laid her eggs and then 2 months later the male swam over to fertilize them. In chordates, only fish and amphibians use external fertilization. All other chordates use internal fertilization. Another adaptation for reproduction is where the embryos develop. Oviparous organisms lay eggs outside of the mother's body. Sometimes the eggs are incubated, like with birds, but many times the eggs are just laid and left, as with turtles, reptiles, and fish and invertebrates and amphibians. Animals that are ovoviviparous allow the eggs to develop inside the organism's body. The name ovoviviparous means egg live birth. Embryos develop inside the mother's body, as we just said, and they are dependent entirely on a yolk sac. They do not receive any nutrition from the mother. The eggs usually hatch within the mother's body, or they are released immediately before hatching. Guppies, sharks, and our hissing cockroaches are examples of ovoviviparous animals. Lastly, we have viviparous species. Those are animals in which the embryos obtain nutrients from the mother's body during the development. Most mammals are viviparous, as are some insects, sharks, bony fishes, amphibians, and reptiles. In placental mammals, a specialized organ called the placenta grows in the mother's uterus. This is a temporary organ. The placenta allows for the exchange of nutrients and waste between the mother and the developing young. What the mother eats, her babies eat. In other viviparous organisms that are not placental, the young are nourished by secretions from the mother's reproductive tract, but there is no placental development, as we just said. Most newborn mammals and newly hatched birds and reptiles look very much like mini adults. Body proportions might be different. Newborns might have more or less fur or feathers, but it's pretty clear that a baby gorilla will not grow up to be a totally different organism like an armadillo. For invertebrates, though, it's not very clear. Their young larval stage undergoes metamorphosis, a process that leads to dramatic body changes. The larval stage and the adult stage look very different from each other, as we see here in this picture of the development of a fish called a zebra danio. A complete metamorphosis involves total body change, from larva to adult. This sometimes includes the addition of wings or a complete change in mouth parts. Here you can see the complete metamorphosis of a monarch butterfly. The pupal stage is in the middle row. Except for the coloring, not much else is the same. While many insects like butterflies, cicadas, moths, and mealworms undergo complete metamorphosis, many others undergo incomplete metamorphosis. The young immature forms are called nymphs. In this picture, you can see that the nymph or young dragonfly does not undergo a pupal stage. Instead, it resembles the adult somewhat, but it lacks functional sex organs and other structures like wings. These develop as the organism molts over and over time. Grasshoppers, our hissing cockroaches, frogs, and toads all undergo this type of metamorphosis. All metamorphosis is controlled by hormones, or chemicals that control body procedures affecting other tissue. Care of the offspring also varies greatly, from no care at all to years of care. One rule of thumb is the more intensive long-term the care is, the fewer the offspring the organism has at one time. Both parents can care for the offspring, or sometimes just the female does. This is common in mammals and birds. Most aquatic invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and reptiles release large numbers of eggs at one time and then forget them. This strategy favors populations that are spread out and grow rapidly. These organisms have many offspring at one time, and they fend for themselves from birth, as these sea turtle hatchlings are doing up here. As vertebrates left water to live on land, they needed new reproductive strategies to survive with less water. The amniotic egg is one reproductive strategy that allows reptiles, birds, and a few mammals to reproduce outside the mother's body without drying out. Named after one of the 4 membranes that surrounds the developing embryo, it has proved very successful. These 4 layers, the amnion, the yolk sac, chorion, and allantois, along with the shell, provide a protected environment. The yolk sac provides nutrition, while the other parts regulate oxygen transport, waste management, and they cushion the embryo. Even the shell has tiny pores in it to allow waste gases to pass out. Compared to the tiny fish eggs in the diagram below, you can see how more complex the structures have evolved to serve the developing embryo. Page 285 in your textbook has a more detailed diagram, and if you have a bird or a reptile for your video assignment, it's worth checking out. Mammals have 3 unique reproduction strategies and one strategy in common. That is that they all nourish their young with milk produced by the mother in mammary glands. The oldest type of mammalian reproduction is that of monotremes. These egg-laying mammals are native to Australia and New Zealand. There are only 5 known species in existence, a platypus and 4 types of echidnas, or spiny anteaters. Marsupials are also primarily found in Australia, with a few species in North America. These are the pouched animals. They include koalas, mahogany gliders, kangaroos, cuscuses, and many others. The most common marsupial we see here in the United States is the possum. In this photo, you can see how underdeveloped the young are when they're born. They crawl from the birth canal up the mother's belly and into the pouch. Here they attach to a teat and continue receiving nourishment until they're old enough to leave the pouch and begin to learn adult ways. No bigger than a bean. They're truly amazing. Placentals are the most common type of mammal found all over the globe, from Arctic to Antarctic and everywhere in between. As we've said before, these animals develop a temporary organ that governs the exchange of nutrients and waste between mother and baby. This organ is expelled from the mother's body after the birth of the baby. So, here are some questions that you should be able to answer. You should be able to compare and contrast sexual and asexual reproduction and discuss the advantages and disadvantages of each. The 2 types of fertilization and the differences between them. How about the 3 ways that embryos develop? Oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. What are they? What are the differences? And lastly, what survival advantage does a placental mammal have over other mammals? I know there's a grammar mistake in there. But anyways, what advantages do placentals have? So, draw a line at the bottom, write your summary,